not minimized. I see me.
Ah, that's you last week.
I don't want to see me anyway.
You don't want to see you
Last
anyway.
week I got home and it was still broadcasting from my computer. It said that.
Even though we waited for the cost for an hour.
It showed me moving around.
Okay.
Don't worry, it wasn't bad.
Okay, everybody. Hi, everybody. I know I'm competing with the president tonight. Sorry? You didn't have a choice. Okay, what I wanted to talk about tonight. Am I hearing? What am I hearing? Am I hearing something playing back? Is that my imagination? No? I felt like I was here. Okay, what I wanted to talk about tonight is a certain perspective on Amalek. And those who were here in the fall, we did have a little conversation about Amalek in that last Tanakh class where we talked about ways that we might think about the Midrashim about Esav. I remember Amalek is Esav's grandson, so in that context we talked a bit about Amalek. I wanted to talk about a different perspective tonight. And I wanted to introduce it by, again, I hope everybody has a Tanakh, by opening to what we know as Parashat Zachor in Devarim chapter 25. Devarim chapter 5, actually for those who are in the regular program next week, right, when Semach comes in and does a couple of lessons on how to Amei HaMikra parse Psukim, this Pasuk is a great example, right, of how you can parse it in more than one way, and it means two completely different things. So let's look at actually Devarim 25, 17, and 18. We're not actually going to discuss these Psukim, I just want to use them as a kind of a jumping off point. So this is Parashat Zachor. Zachor asher aseh lecha Amalek baderech b'tzeidchem mimitzrayim. Remember that which Amalek did to you on the way. Jana, I'm hearing feedback. Jana, what? Yeah.
Okay.
And worse, it's like 10 seconds later.
Okay.
Thank you. It's like when you have those bad connections to Israel and you hear yourself, it's terrible. Sorry, everybody.
You're going to have to see yourself for a second.
See myself, I hear myself.
The citation of Devarim?
Chat 25, 17.
Hey, talk and see if you can hear yourself now.
Hi, can I hear myself? I think it's better.
Okay. You got muted the speaker.
Thank you. Okay. Asher karcha baderach veyazanev b'cha kol hanechshalim acharecha. Okay, I'm not even going to translate that part. I want to look at the last 6 words. Ve'ata ayef v'yagea. You were tired and weary. V'lo yarei Elohim. Now, there's 2 ways to construe this, right? Yes. Page, anybody? Deuteronomy 25, 18. Okay? So we have the Atnachta, the main verse break, on the word Yagea. Right? So the way our cantillation signs as well as our vocalization construes this pasuk is, you were tired and weary. Vilo, pause. Vilo yarei Elohim, and he, and yarei is vocalized as a verb, he did not fear God. You could do that completely differently, right? You could put the etnachta 3 words earlier on acharecha, and instead of yarei, you can have yirei with a shva, which would translate ve'ata ayef v'yagea v'lo yirei Elohim. You were tired and weary and not God-fearing. Now, there's really 2 ways to construe what's going on here, and I don't want to spend more time on this passage. I just want to point out that these 2 ways of construing this passage really reflect 2 very different ways, both of which are completely valid and really complement each other. 2 very different ways of seeing Amalek. One, which we're not going to focus on, but we talked a bit about last semester, is to see Amalek as that which, that obstacle in your path, which is a kind of externalization of your own weakness, right? Of your own unworthiness, of your own inability to cross over. Right? Remember we talked at the end of last semester about that that Kalbach teaching, and the Hasidic teaching that Shlomo brought. Remember that God, when God created the world, remember this, right? When God created the world, God made a deal with the ocean that it would split when God's children would come to its banks. And the ocean said, well, how will I know who to split for? And God gives it an ID picture. This is what my people look like. And when the people come to the sea, they say, open, split, it's us. It's God's people. You made a deal 3,000 years ago, right? You're going to split. 2,000 years, you're going to split. And the sea says, well, let me check the photo. I've been holding it for the last couple of thousand years. Looks at the photo, looks at the people, and says, I don't see it. It doesn't match up. And we talked about that, right? And somehow the ocean becomes convinced that this really is the same people. It's just a people that's become downtrodden, that's become beaten up, that's lost their sense of who they are. But really, it's the people that has the promise to be the people in the photo. Right? And according to this Hasidic teaching, what Amalek is, right? Amalek is the force that looks at that photo and says, actually, you can never become the people in that photo. Right? In other words, Amalek, by that teaching, is saying actually you're not Yirei Elohim, right? You, right? It's Bnei Israel's own weakness, right? It's Bnei Israel's own inability to cross over, right? To achieve the aspirations, to become who they are meant to become. That's one view, and we're not going to talk about that tonight. It's a very, I think, very important view. And if you sort of, hold one finger in this text and turn the other finger to the core Amalek text, which is in Shemot chapter 17. That reading, again, we're not going to focus on it, but that reading has a very strong foundation also in Sefer Shemot, because in Shemot chapter 17, verse 8, Vayavo Amalek, Amalek comes, Amalek came. When does Amalek come? Well, if you look at the previous verse says, right? Previous verse is the culmination of a story in which, one of many, many times when the children of Israel sort of doubt God's ability to care for them, right? And they say, they had said at the end of verse 7, Hayesh Hashem b'kirbeinu im ayin, a verse we talked about 2 weeks ago, is God really in our midst or not? Vayavo Amalek, right? So if you see the juxtaposition of these two passages, again, you can see Amalek's coming as a kind of manifestation of their own lack of faith, of their own weakness, right? Rashi quotes a very beautiful midrash in this regard. Rashi says the following. Gives an analogy to a little child who's being carried around all the time on his father's shoulders. And says the following thing: Mashallah Adam sherikiv b'no aktefo v'yatzeh derech. It's analogous to a person who puts his son on his shoulders and goes out on the road. Haya oto haben ro'eh chayfetz v'omer Abba tol chayfetz ze v'tein li. The child would see an object and he would say, Daddy, give me that thing. I want that thing. V'hu notein lo, and the father would fetch it for him. V'chein shniya v'chein shlishit, and again, every time the kid sees something, the kid says, I want it, the father gives it to him. Then pag'u be'adam echad, at a certain point they meet up with somebody. Amar lo ato haben, ra'ita et Abba? So this little kid on his father's shoulder says, hey, have you seen my father? Amar lo aviv, so his father says to him, Eincha yodeh hechan ani, you don't know who I am? You forgot, right, who's carrying you on the shoulders and getting you everything you want. Hishlicho me'alav, he puts him down on the floor. Uva kelav unishacho, right, and the dog comes and bites him. In other words, again, this is the view that the Amalek is a manifestation of your own vulnerability that emerges from your own not being who you're meant to be. Right? Amalek is that kind of internal obstacle, right, to crossing over, to achieving your aspirations. Okay, that's the view we're not going to talk about. It's a very important view. We're not going to talk about that. I want to talk about a completely different view. And it's the Velo Yarei Elohim view. In other words, the view that is highlighted by the parsing of the verse in Deuteronomy that we have. You are a Yefi Agea, you Bnei Israel, you were tired and weary, and Amalek was not God-fearing. Amalek was not God-fearing. Amalek's attack on you is a manifestation yes, of your weakness, maybe only a physical weakness, maybe also a spiritual weakness, but moreover, right, what it's really a manifestation of is the fact that Amalek is not God-fearing. And I wanted to spend our time together tonight sort of developing that perspective, right? This perspective of Amalek as a kind of external force rather than a kind of internal weakness. And I wanted to start by looking at, I have handouts here, by looking at one source on the sheet, if you could pass these around. This is a very famous Rashi on a verse at the last verse of the Amalek story in Exodus, so it's the last verse of chapter 17. We'll read from chapters. Don't look at your handout yet. I'll tell you when. Let's first look in the Chumash, Exodus chapter 17, verse 14. Vayomer Hashem el Moshe, ketov zot zikaron b'sefer v'sim be'oznei Yehoshua, ki macho emche et zecher Amalek mitachat hashamayim. God says to Moshe, write this as a remembrance in the book, and put it in the ears of Yehoshua that I will surely wipe out the remembrance of Amalek from under the heavens. Vayiven Moshe Mizbeach vayikra shmo Hashem Nisi. Moshe builds an altar and he calls its name God is Nisi, my banner, perhaps my standard. We'll skip that for now. And Moshe says in verse 16, Vayomer ki yad al kes ya, milchama l'Hashem ba'Amalek midor dor. Moshe says, a hand is on the seat of God. There is a battle. Like God has a battle, or a battle for God, or God's battle against Amalek from generation to generation. There's a very, very famous Rashi here on the words ki yad al kes ya. And Rashi, again, is quoting a midrash. This is on the side of your page that says Tehillim Perek Peitet at the top. Okay? So the third text on the page, I apologize that all these texts are only in Hebrew. So Rashi, the third text on the page, Rashi says, Ki yad al kes ya. Yado shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Actually, we'll skip that line, go to the next line. He says, Umahu kes, v'lo ne'amar kiseh, v'af Hashem nechlak lechatzio. He says, why does it say the word case instead of kiseh? Right? The word kiseh is seat or throne. Why does it say case, a short version of that? And also the name, the divine name, is broken in half. We don't have the Yud Hey Vav Hey name, we just have the Yud Hey. So both of those words are truncated. Why is that? Nishba HaKadosh Baruch Hu she'en shemo shalem ve'en kis'o shalem ad she'imachet shmo shel Amalek kulo. God swears that his name is not complete and his throne is not complete until the name of Amalek is entirely wiped out. And when Amalek's name is obliterated, Hashem shalem v'hakisei shalem. Only then will God's name and God's throne be complete. Shene'amar, and now Rashi, again quoting the Midrash, is working off of some psukim in the psalm, which is the next text on your page, Psalm 9. I don't give you the whole psalm, I give a few verses there. Shene'amar ha'oyev tamu charvot lanetzach. Right, if you look at Psalm 9, verse 7, it's the middle line in the next passage. We have ha'oyev tamu charvot lanetzach. Okay. V'arim natashta avad zichram hema. Right? The enemy is, Tamu is completely obliterated, destroyed forever, and the cities are bereft. Their zichram, their memory, as in Zecher Amalek, right? Their memory, their remembrance is lost. Okay, so Rashi is working off of this pasuk. He says, so oyev tamu charvot lanetzach. What oyev, what enemy is that talking about? Zehu Amalek. Right? The pasuk in Psalms is talking about a particular enemy, right? It's Amalek. How do we know it's talking about Amalek? Because about him, it is written in Amos, Ve'evrato shamra netzach. His anger he kept forever. So it's the same word netzach. right? Netzach, forever. Whose anger, by the way, is being talked about in Amos? Anybody, if anybody has a whole Tanakh, is it actually Amalek? Amos 1:11. It's Edom, right? Edom is Esav, and as we saw, Esav is Amalek's grandfather. Okay, so this is a prophecy against Edom, and Amos is saying he watched his anger forever. In other words, Edom is still holding on to his anger against Yaakov Yisrael. Right? That's how they're understanding. Amalek is still eternally trying to destroy us because of a grudge that he can't let go of. Okay. Now back to the psalm, right? Ha'oyev tamu charvot lanetzach. We've just identified that enemy as Edom, Amalek. V'arim natashta avad zichram, and their remembrance, right, is destroyed. And what mahu omer acharav? What is the verse right after it says that the enemy has been destroyed? Its remembrance has been obliterated. So look in the psalm. What's the next verse? Psalm 9:8. V'Hashem le'olam yeshev. Konen lemishpat kis'o. Only then, only once the enemy is obliterated, only once the remembrance, right, the name of Edom, Amalek, is obliterated, only then will God sit eternally, right? Only then will his throne be established in justice, right? There you have the word kisei, throne, completely. There you have God's name in its entirety, okay? Rashi concludes, Mahu me'acharav Hashem l'olam yeshev harei Hashem shalem. There's the full name of God. Konein lemishpat kis'o harei kis'o shalem. So you see, his throne is complete only once the enemy is obliterated. Okay. So what this midrash is doing is something incredibly striking, I think, which is it's making a claim that actually God's dominion on this earth is not complete. God has imperfect dominion. God's name is not complete. God's throne is not complete, meaning God does not actually have complete dominion over our world and cannot have complete dominion over our world until Amalek is destroyed, which means the Amalek is the enemy of God. Right? The Amalek actually limits, it's a limitation, right, on God's dominion over this world. Okay? That is a very different view. It's a very different view from the first view that we talked about very briefly, right? And by the way, these two views are not just two views about Amalek. These are essentially the two main possible understandings of evil in the world, right? Because you can't have a perfect God who is infinitely powerful, who creates a world that has evil. Right? If God is infinitely good and infinitely powerful, where is evil coming from? So essentially, there's two main ways you go. God's infinitely good, right? God is infinitely powerful, but there's something in God's creation, maybe us, Genesis 3, right? Maybe us, that somehow introduces sin into this world. Now, of course, that bumps the question back. Well, but God created us, so how come we're not perfectly good? But then you can sort of work with that question, right? But one view is, yes, God is infinitely good. God is infinitely powerful. And if there's imperfection in the world, you have to look at the source of that inside ourselves. There's a completely different view, right, which is to say that, yes, God is good, but actually God is not infinitely powerful. And the existence of evil in the world attests to the fact that God's dominion over the world is actually not complete. And this is the view here, right? God's dominion will one day be complete. One day, Kis'o Ushmo, his throne and his name will be complete. But at this point, that's actually not true. Because there's something called Amalek in the world. Right? There's some force out there which is actually a limitation on God's power. Yeah?
Is there an assumption that fact was, I don't know what language you said, God's choice? That God limited God's own power and sort of gave people agency to bring God to full power over the earth?
Okay, so hold off on that, because I think you could probably answer that one way or the other, and I'm not going to try to attribute one or the other answer to this midrash, which is kind of oblique to start with. Okay, but I'll offer a kind of a reading of, if we want to take this view of Amalek, how does that read in the Chumash, right? And then you can think how you want to work with that if you find that view attractive. Again, I think both of these views are there, both about Amalek, about the world in general, and I think they're two contradictory views that complement each other and sort of sit side by side. So maybe we'll talk about that a bit later. Okay, so this view, right, actually is a view of a dynamic world in which there's actually a battle that's going on. Right? There's a milchama Hashem ba'Amalek midor dor. Right? There's a cosmic battle going on till today, right? Being played out between good and evil, between order and chaos, between God and something that God doesn't yet fully control. Okay? And what I want to do is talk a bit about sort of where these views appear in the Tanakh in general, not spend too much time on that, and then sort of play it out in terms of Amalek. So first of all, as you, I'm sure, know, this second view is not the dominant view in classical Judaism, although it is a very important view within classical Judaism. For example, in Kabbalistic texts, right? The Ramban, Nachmanides, in the kind of ends of his commentary where he talks about more Kabbalistic things, reflects this kind of view a lot, right? So this view sort of does exist within strands of Judaism, but it's certainly not the dominant view, nor is it the dominant view of the Chumash. It appears in the Chumash, we'll talk about this soon, it's not the dominant view. For example, our Chumash begins in Genesis chapter 1, right, which, as scholars like to point out, is not what you have in other ancient Near Eastern stories of beginnings, right, which is a battle between the gods. That's not what Genesis 1 does. Genesis 1 talks about God who goes out there in a quite ironic fashion, right, unfolds goodness. The alternative myth, right, is very dominant in the ancient Near East. We have it in texts like the Enuma Elish, which we'll actually look at briefly in a few minutes, which begins with a cosmic battle, right, between the person, the god who's going to emerge as the chief god. And who is that god? See how well you know your Avodah Zarah? Avodah Zarah quiz. Who's the chief Babylonian god? Marduk. Okay, Marduk, okay? And Marduk has to fight these other gods and goddesses, right? There is this, battle. Marduk ends up vanquishing these other gods. Marduk is declared king. A palace is built for Marduk. And every year on the 1st of Nisan, there's a Babylonian festival in which Marduk is ritually re-enthroned as king. Now, people like Cassuto, who I probably have quoted every week, point out that in Genesis 1, not only is there no battle, but Cassuto claims, you can take it or leave it, Cassuto claims that there are certain aspects of the story in Genesis chapter 1 which are purposely there to argue against this cosmic battle myth. For example, Tehom. Sorry? Tiamat, that's right. See, somebody still, in good Jewish tradition, learns the Babylonian creation myths, right? Yeah? In England too, yeah? I love it. Okay, yay, Reformed Jews. See, somebody still learns the classical tradition. Okay, good. Do you have to pass an Akkadian test to get smicha? No. No test. Okay. Hebrew test? Okay. Okay. Yes, so Leah, read us Genesis 1, chapter 2. For those who don't usually hear me, just be aware that I make fun of all denominations equally, okay? Leah, go ahead. Unless you want to do it in Akkadian ad-lib translation, it's Hebrew for tonight. Yes? Sorry, no. Chapter 1. Sorry, chapter 1, verse 2. Yes. Okay, so the earth was tohu vavohu, it was chaotic and void or whatever. V'choshech al pnei tehom, there was darkness on the face of the deep. And the spirit or the wind of God was hovering over the surface of the water, and then God said, let there be light, and there's light, etc. Now this tehom, people like Cassuto point out, is that word, the deep, the abyss, right, the muddy, dark waters, right, is cognate with Akkadian Tiamat, who is the goddess of the chaotic waters, the oceans. It is Tiamat that Marduk has to vanquish, right, in order to become king. Okay, so people like Cassuto point out, well, here you have sort of Tiamat tamed, right, Tiamat undeified, right, instead of it being Tiamat, an actual divine force, right, it's just water, and there's only one deity. It's God who sort of then brings order to the world. One other example that Cassuto brings, there's many of them. This one's quite striking. I'm not sure I'm convinced by it, but it's striking nonetheless. Is on day 5. Day 5 is the birds, right, the fish and the fowl. Okay, so when it talks about the sea creatures, it says in chapter 1, verse 21, Vayivra Elohim et hataninim hagdolim v'et kol nefesh hachaya haromeset asher shurtzu hamayim leminehem, etc. Right, God created the taninim hagdolim, the great sea creatures, right, and all of the living creatures that swarmed in the water. Now, there's two funny things about this. Number one, that it mentions the Taninim at all, right? Why doesn't it just talk about all of the swarming things in the waters? And number two, and you wouldn't notice this unless you really studied this text quite well, the verb vayivra is actually distinctive in this chapter, because the only places outside of this passage where it uses the word bara, to create, as opposed to asa, to make, or some other verb, is at the beginning, right, the big introduction, Bereshit bara Elohim, in the beginning God created, right, the heavens and the earth, and later on, when God creates, in verse 27, when God creates the human being, which is certainly a marked creation. But all of a sudden with the Taninim, A, it mentions a particular kind, not species, but let's say a big, a particular group, right, of sea creatures, and B, it uses the word to create. Cassuto claims, and again, you can take it or leave it, it's an interesting point, that the sea creatures, and we'll see this in a minute when we look at some other texts, that the sea creatures also were these kinds of mythic deities of the deep. And again, in the cosmic myths that Genesis, according to Cassuto, is arguing against, God actually did battle with these sea creatures. Here, the point is not only did he do battle, God actually makes them, and it wants to highlight them by using that verb to create, which is a real kind of creation, ex nihilo. God sort of in God's will simply makes them. Okay, so again, you could disagree with any particular example, but it's certainly true that our dominant myth, meaning the myth with which the Torah begins, is a myth that does not include a battle, which is simply God sort of entering the stage and creating this unfolding of ordered goodness. Okay, nevertheless, right, as you're probably aware, the Tanakh includes other views in other places. And in particular, you have this, and we'll just look at a couple of examples, you have many, many places in the poetic parts of the Tanakh where these cosmic battle myths are referred to. And I'll show you a couple of examples in a minute. Let me just say to start with that when poetic texts refer use language that refers to mythic stuff, it doesn't necessarily mean, right, that the authors of those texts, the communities that had those texts, believed in those myths. We also, right, use language that is mythic language sometimes, even though, right, a lot of the language that we retain, right, is language that has its foundation in myths that we no longer are even aware. For example, the word cereal, right, which is from the goddess of, right? That's a word that we use without even knowing, right, its underpinning. Now, these texts go beyond just using that word cereal, right? They actually describe a battle, okay? Whether that means that these texts are still, from within a worldview where that battle is believed in, or whether it's using it in a kind of metaphoric way, I can't tell you. I just want to point out that this myth of a cosmic battle is there in some of our texts. So if you switch to the other side of the page, I'll just show you a couple of these. There's like tens of them, but I'll just show you a couple of them. We'll skip the first two for a second. Let's look at the third one from Isaiah 51. This is a kind of interesting one because it actually compares the splitting of the sea, a topic we'll get to a bit more later. It actually compares the splitting of the sea with the primordial battle. Now, actually, before we do that, let me read you a teeny bit of Enuma Elish, so you'll see why that comparison makes sense. Okay. Did you guys actually study Enuma Elish? No. All right. So as I said, Enuma Elish is the Babylonian creation myth. Marduk is doing battle with the other divine forces, in particular his arch enemy Tiamat, right, the goddess of the chaotic deep. And the following thing happens, right? Joyfully they did homage. Marduk is king. They conferred on him scepter, throne, and vestment. They gave him matchless weapons that ward off the foes. Now, what is this weapon? How is he going to kill Tiamat? Go and cut off the life of Tiamat. May the winds bear her blood to places undisclosed. Okay? Then, here's how he actually dispatches Tiamat. Okay? The four winds he stationed, that nothing of her might escape: the south wind, the north wind, the east wind, the west wind. Close to his side he held the net, the gift of his brother Anu. He brought forth the evil wind, the whirlwind, the hurricane, the fourfold wind, the sevenfold wind, the cyclone, the matchless wind. Then he sent forth the winds he had brought forth, the seven of them, to stir up the inside of Tiamat. They rose up behind him. Then the Lord raised up the flood storm, his mighty weapon. He mounted the storm chariot, irresistible and terrifying. So what's he doing? If this were a movie, what's happening to Tiamat? I'll continue. The Lord spread out his net to enfold her. The evil wind which followed behind he let loose in her face. When Tiamat opened her mouth to consume him, he drove in the evil wind that she closed not her lips. As the fierce winds charged her belly, her body was distended and her mouth was wide open. He released the arrow. It tore her belly. It cut through her inside, splitting the heart. Having thus subdued her, he extinguished her life. He cast down her carcass to stand upon it. What did he do? What? He did what? I know, but what's happening on the screen, guys? A little visual imagination. I'll read on. Then the Lord paused to view her dead body, that he might divide the monster and do artful works. He split her like a shellfish into two parts. Half of her he set up and sealed it as sky, pulled down the bar and posted guards. He bade them to allow not her waters to escape. Does that make it clearer? What? He split the waters with the wind. Right? Here's this watery chaos that has dominion over the earth. He blows into her, splitting her into two. Part of her he puts up there and vaults her so it can't escape. And the other half is down here. Does that sound familiar? What does it sound like? Yes. So the first thing it sounds like is the creation story, right? But again, we have an ironic version of this, right? Where the Ruach Elohim, right, the wind of God, is hovering on the Tehom, right? And then on day two, what does God do? God splits that waters, right? Puts half of it up there, makes a rakia so it can't come down, and the other half becomes the terrestrial waters that then God boundaries in another way, making the oceans and dry land, right? But here, right, it's a dynamic battle. Again, it's the wind. Marduk's weapon is a wind, right? He splits it with a wind. Now, as some of you said, this also sounds a bit like Kriyat Yamsuf, right? Because how's Kriyat Yamsuf happen? What's the mechanism? Right, the splitting of the sea. This is Exodus 14. Right? Moshe stretches out his hands. Right, 14, verse 21. Moshe stretches out his hand over the ocean. And God causes a wind, a powerful wind, to blow all night, right? And it makes the ocean into dry land, splitting the ocean. Okay? We'll get back to this episode in a minute. I just want to spend a minute with you looking at some of these poetic texts. First, as I said, the middle text on the other side of the page, Isaiah 51. Here, there's an explicit comparison between the primordial battle against the ocean and the splitting of the sea. And it says the following thing. We'll look at verse 9. Uri, Uri, livshi oz. Zroa Hashem, right? God's hand, wake up, right? Dress yourself in might. Uri kimei kedem, wake up like in days of old. Dorot olamim, like in generations of yore. Hello, check it out. At hiya machzevet Rahav mecholelet tanim. You are the one who split Rahav, right? Who destroyed the Tanin. The Tanin, right? That primordial sea creature. Rahab is another name for the chaotic waters, right? These were names of divinities. You are the one who did that way back. And not only that, verse 10, Halo ad hi hamachrevet yam, me tehom rabah. You are the one who dried out the primordial ocean, right? Or the ocean, the Yam Suf, right? You're the one who dried out the ocean, right? Who dried out the watery abyss, right? You are the one who made ma'amakei yam, who made the depths of the ocean, derech la'avor geulim. You are the one who made in the watery ocean a path for the redeemed ones to cross. And that's clearly a reference to Kriyat Yam Suf. Okay, so here we have, since God, you are the one who always does this, right? At the very beginning of time, right? You battled the sea, right? And later on, right, you split the sea so your redeemed ones can go through. So God, do it again. And you have the same thing. We won't read it together, but the next text, which is Psalm 74, here there's an appeal. God, you did this in primordial times. You smashed not just the Yam and the Taninim, but verse 14, the Leviathan. Right? It's not just a nice fish waiting for us, veggies or semi-veggies, to eat, in Gan Eden, right? But again, it was this kind of force, right? The force of the watery chaos that God did battle. You're the one who did this, so do it again now, right? This becomes a kind of a paradigm. Okay, so I just wanted to point out there's many, 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 many other poetic texts in which this myth is mentioned. What I want to suggest is that this myth is not just a kind of dead myth, right, that just comes up kind of in poetic context as a kind of metaphor, but that this myth actually has a life within the Chumash itself, and particularly in Sefer Shemot. And I want to go back to the story of Kriyat Yam Suf, of the splitting of the sea, and point out that it's not only that the way in which God splits the sea, right, taking this watery mass and blowing the wind over it so that it splits. Right? It's not only that which kind of looks something like this primordial battle, but as we talked about a bit 2 weeks ago, God's battle, right, God's activity against the Egyptians truly is not just a mechanism to get Bnei Israel out of there, but it truly is cast as a battle against other gods, right? And we saw this, right? We saw this when the purpose of the plagues is spelled out, that Pharaoh know, that the Egyptians know that I'm the Lord, that the Egyptians know that I'm the Lord in the midst of the earth, that the Egyptians know, Ki ein kamoni b'chol ha'aretz, that the Egyptians know that there is none like me in all of the earth. And finally, in talking about and introducing Makat B'chorot, God says, Uv'chol Elohei Mitzrayim eseh shvatim ani Hashem, right? I will do judgments against, right, all of the gods of Egypt. So in our very rationalistic, monotheistic way, right, we tend to understand that is, I'm going to show that they're not really gods, that I'm the only one. That's not actually what it says, right? What it actually says is, I'm going to do battle against those gods. Right? Ein kamoni b'chol haaretz doesn't mean there's no other gods. It means there's no other gods like me. When the children of Israel say in the Song of the Sea, right, Mi chamocha ba'elim Hashem, it doesn't say there's no other divine powers. It says there's no other divine power, right? None other among the divine powers is like you. It's a very different statement. Okay, so there were a couple of hands up. I'm going to pause and take those hands, and then I'll continue. Yes. Yes. Yes, right. So this is in Right, this is an interesting case of where there seems to be a different version of the text that our Masoretic version is arguing against, right? This is in the end of Devarim, right? Hold on a second. Chapter 32, verse 8, right? I think there's other texts which actually lemispar b'nei el or something like that, right? Suggesting, but we have this elsewhere, right? Right? Moab has Kamosh, we have God. I mean, so we tend to read that. So you want to believe in Kamosh, believe in Kamosh, okay? And the other view is no. We understand there's these other gods, right? But our God is fighting your gods, okay? Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. I think the other version is Bnei El. He talks about Tigay in the JPS Deuteronomy. He talks about it, so you can check that. Rebecca, do you want to say something? Yeah.
Just a question of comparison to Yeshayahu, the first Yechezkel text that we skipped over.
So I'll look at the Yechezkel text in a second. So hold on to the Yechezkel text. Yeah.
The word Elohim also means judges. It means other things. So is it so clear that in those contexts it's really referring to other gods?
Bechol Elohei Mitzrayim Eseh Shvatim means they're judges? I don't think so. First of all, it's not so clear that Elohim means judges, right? That's rabbinic interpretation, right? V'nikrav bal habayit lifnei Elohim, right? The person goes before Elohim, right? To take a vow is understood as he goes before the judges. That also, by the way, goes back to a Babylonian parallel where there were actually deities, right? In the you actually took when I was in Nepal, I saw this. I have to say, I actually saw this. See, I learned something. In Durbar Square in Kathmandu, right? There's like millions of Hindu gods and stuff, and there's this one like huge god where government officials take the oath, take it before the god, not before the judges. So it's not so clear there either. Probably does mean before the judges as a kind of development from a time when the judgment took place before the gods. But I don't think in these contexts that's what it means. That's it, right? Ki ein chamoni b'chol ha'aretz, there's none other like me, no other what like me. Clearly, there's no other God like me. All right, whatever. You could take this or leave it. I'm gonna play with it, and 9 o'clock you're free. You're free to go anytime, but 9 o'clock you're truly free to go and take it or leave it. But I want to develop it first. Yeah, go ahead.
It's like a little historical question.
Yeah.
A little historical question, which is a little afraid to go into, but it is like imagining what the people during the time of Moses' creation understood both through their myths. How does this relate to one another?
How the what?
How people during the time of like the beginning or early development of both of these myths understood their myths in relationship to the other. So like, is the Genesis creation story maybe viewed by the ancient folks who developed it or thought of it or received it? Do they understand that myth also? It's true with this other Babylonian mythic story with Nimash and Timad.
Okay, so Ainli Musag. Okay, I don't know, and I don't want to overplay. I don't want to overplay the degree to which Tiamat is in the Torah. That's not actually so interesting to me or relevant, right? What I do want to do is use that as a kind of a backdrop, right, for highlighting the fact that Sefer Shemot, if you see Sefer Shemot as a kind of another creation story, which it is. Sefer Shemot begins with Bnei Yisrael paru v'yishutzu v'yibu v'yatzmu me'od me'od. Right, it increased and multiplied and swarmed, right, very much like Genesis 1. Right, it begins with Moshe's mother seeing him and seeing that he is good. Right, there's a lot of language. It puts him with teva and an ark. And there's a lot of language there that is reviewing the first creation. Right, but this creation is not an ex nihilo. God walks into the world and says, "I got a beautiful world here." Right, this is a miserable place where God has to walk into it and do a battle. That's all I'm saying. That's really all I'm saying. Right? Shemot is a story of a battle. And the point I'm making is it's a battle against gods. Now, what they really think these gods are, do they think they're real gods? Do they think they're forces? Do they think they're subordinate gods? Do they think they're down here, just a little superhuman? I don't care for now. The point is it's an image of God actually engaged in a battle, as opposed to a blank slate that God steps onto and draws a beautiful picture. It's a different view. It's a fight against forces of evil. God is fighting the forces of evil. And those forces of evil have power. That's all I want to say. I can't go beyond that and imagine. I can't imagine how people 3,000 years ago understood the language they were using, because I don't actually know how you understand the language you're using. I have a hard enough time knowing how I understand the language I'm using, the religious language I use in particular. So I'm not going to try to guess, what I don't even know what the people in Nepal think when they talk about the 6-year-old living goddess. What do they mean? I don't know what they mean. I would have to talk a lot to even begin to imagine that I know what they mean. I still couldn't, because I don't live their religion. So I don't want to try to get that far into it. That's all I'm trying to do is show it's a different paradigm. It's a dynamic paradigm of a God who's forced to do battle in order to have the dominion that God wants to have, which is a dominion of justice. I want to emphasize that. It's a dominion of justice. Every single text that we have which talks about this battle always talks about it in the context of justice. God wants to establish God's throne in justice, which is what God's doing here. You can't beat up on people. I'm the God of justice. You're doing bad. Therefore, I'm going to vanquish you. That's all I want to say. I'm going to go on a little bit, okay, and then we'll take a... Yeah, go ahead, please. I'm such a softie. Leah, go ahead. Forget the mic. I'll repeat what you say.
I just have a question. I have never understood how Leviathan is part of that myth.
Yes.
Way,
Yeah.
Like the Tananim.
Yeah.
Like it's like at the end, God will.
Yes, I will show you. Good question. So see, she set you up, Jordan, and we're all happy. Yechezkel. Just very quickly look at Yechezkel, and then I'm going to move on away from all this and go back to Amalek, because that's really where I want to go. Yechezkel, we have two passages from Yechezkel. Very interesting. The first one, right, is actually from the Haftarah from Parshat Va'era. What happens in Parshat Va'era, among other things, right? That is where Moshe first appears before the Egyptians, throws down his staff, and what does his staff become? Wrong. Set you up. When Moshe first talks to God and says, what if the people don't believe me, his staff turns into a snake. Very interesting. Why a snake? Snake. What's that about? We know snakes. Okay? But that's not what happens when he goes before Pharaoh. When he goes before Pharaoh, it becomes a tanin. It's not quite the same thing. Okay? Now, and what happens after that? He does the first makkah, which is dam, or the plague of blood. The waters turn into blood. This is the Haftarah. This is a prophecy against Egypt, which we read as the Haftarah for Parshat Va'era. Take a look. Ben Adam, sim panech al paro melech Mitzrayim. Right? Prophesy against Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. The current Pharaoh, the Pharaoh in Yechezkel's time. Say to him, verse 3, Hineni alecha paro melech Mitzrayim. I am against you, Paro, the king of Egypt. The tanin hagadol harovetz b'tochi orav. You, Pharaoh, are that tanin, right? You are that great sea creature who crouches inside the river. Asher amar li orivani asitani. You are the one who says, it's my river and I've created it. In other words, you are a god. But I'm against you. I'm going to trap you. I'm going to fish you out, verse 4. And I'm going to put the hook in your jaw, right? And I'm going to raise you up out of the river, and all the other fish are going to stick to you, and they're all going to come out of the river, and I'm going to throw you into the wilderness, and you're going to be eaten by the birds, and everybody's going to know, exactly the language we have in the Sefer Shemot, V'yadu kol yoshrei Mitzrayim ki ani Hashem. Emphasis, ani, they're going to know you're not God, I'm God. Okay? Now look at the next passage, Yechezkel 32. This is maybe even a little more explicit, right? Right here, it's a dirge. Say the following dirge, right? Mitzrayim is already kivyachol gone. Right? Say the following dirge over them, right? You thought you were such a big shot, but second line, tanin bayamim. You are like a tanin in the oceans. But this is what God says, verse 3. I am going to catch you in my net, and I am going to cast you, verse 4, on the face of the fields. And verse 5, I'm going to put your flesh on the mountains, and everything's going to be full of your stuff. And verse 6, I am going to water the earth with your blood. And verse 7, I'm going to cover the heavens, and I'm going to cover the skies. And verse 8, all of the luminaries I will make dark, and I will put darkness on the earth. Now here you have dam and choshech, blood and darkness, the first and last plagues. Right? What is the blood here? What is the blood that fills the rivers? According to Yechezkel, how is Yechezkel understanding the blood that fills the rivers in Exodus? It's the blood of the slain sea god, Tanin, who is a manifestation of Paro casting himself as a god, right? The fact, we don't see it this way, right? That the rivers turn to blood because you've slain the god of the river, who's Paro himself. I am the god of the river, I made it. Right? So it's taking the first and last plagues and doing a reading of Sefer Shemot, which is a dynamic reading, and it's seeing the plagues that God brings in Sefer Shemot as a kind of a redoing of this primordial slaying of this sea monster. Okay? So I'm not the first person who is suggesting, right, that you can read Sefer Shemot as a kind of primordial, a new creation story. It's not the ironic creation of Genesis 1. It's the other kind of creation. It's the cosmic battle between God and these other forces. Okay, I'm going to leave this aside for a minute. I want to get to Amalek, and then I will take some questions. Okay? What I want to say is this. If you look at Shirat Hayam, Exodus 15, and again, we looked at this a little bit a couple of weeks ago. Remember, the Israelites declare awareness of God. Verse 3, Hashem ish milchama. The God, right, is a warrior. God is it's the warrior God. It's the God who does battle. Hashem Shemo. And then they say, as we said before, Mi chamocha, verse 11, Mi chamocha ba'elim Hashem. Who is like you among the gods, O God? This is after describing how God blows his winds, nashata beruchacha, right? God blew his winds and split these waters, right? You are the battle God. You blow your wind, you split the water. There is none like you among the gods. And then it describes the redemption, verse 16. Ad ya'avor amcha Hashem, ad ya'avor amzu kanita, right? All of the peoples of the world are terrified and, sort of standing by while your people cross over. You will bring them to your place. And verse 17, Mikdash Hashem konanu yadecha, God's throne, God's sanctuary, God's palace is established. That's what happens similarly at the end of Enuma Elish. After God does this battle, God's throne is established. Hashem yimloch le'olam va'ed, and God will rule forever in this palace that's being established. Okay? So it's describing the God as a God of war, as a God who is triumphant over other gods, a God whose job it is to bring redemption, right? A God who casts fear over all of the nations of the world so that God's people can walk toward redemption. God's palace is now built, anticipating the end of Sefer Shemot. That's what we do in Sefer Shemot. We build the palace for this God who arose triumphant, right, and redeemed us. We build this palace, and Hashem yimloch le'olam va'ed. That is the story of Shirat Hayam. Now, what I want to say about it is this. The verses that we didn't quite read through, but I'll read them now. After, right, let's look at verse 13. Nachita b'chastecha amzu ga'alta. In your chesed, you led the people whom you redeemed. Right? You led them to your holy place. Verse 14. Sham'u amim yirgazun. The nations heard and were terrified. Chil achaz yoshvei plashet. Terror gripped, right, those who dwell in Pleshet, like the land of Plishtim. Az nivhalu alufei Edom, right, the princes of Edom were terrified. Elei Moav yochazei Morad, right, trembling gripped Moab. Namogu kol yoshvei Canaan, right, everybody who lives in Canaan was I don't even, there's more words in classical Hebrew for fear than we have, so I'm sort of out of words, right? But they were melting in fear. Tzipor aleim eimata v'fachad, fear and dread fell over them. Okay? Every single nation that we have any interaction with, Moab, Edom, Canaan, Plishtim, forget the Egyptians, they're destroyed, right? Every nation that we've had interactions with has been named, and they're all terrified. And they all step aside to allow God to lead God's redeemed people to God's holy place, where God's redeemed people are going to build God a sanctuary, a palace, so God can rule forever. That's the story of Shirat Hayam. Okay? And then what happens, one chapter later, is that Amalek comes. Amalek comes in chapter 17, verse 8. Amalek comes. Every other nation is terrified, will not start up with God's people, but Amalek comes and fights with Yisrael. Right? This is the reading of the V'lo Yarei Elohim from Devarim. Everybody was afraid, but one nation was not afraid, and that's Amalek, which means that Amalek is not just doing battle with Yisrael. According to this reading, Amalek is actually doing battle with God. Amalek is saying, whoa, 1 second, God. You think you're triumphant? You think you can lead your people to redemption? You think the next step is that you're going to ask the people to build your palace and you're going to rule? Well, guess not. Actually, we're going to stop them from doing that. We're going to destroy the possibility of creating a sanctuary for God on this world. We're not going to let God yimloch le'olam va'ed. Right? This is the reading of Amalek that I want to advance here as one reading of Amalek. Now, by the way, we Jews allude to this reading of Amalek every single morning in Tefillah. Because at the end of Az Yashir, right, we say the Shirat Hayam every morning, right? And what do we say? Hashem yimloch le'olam va'ed, ki vasus paro b'chvar. And after we recite the whole passage from Shemot, what do we say? I can't follow this Siddur. It's too. This is the new, right? The new. You got to remember to look on the other side of the page, and I've never used it, so it's a little confusing. So what do we say? Yeah. Okay. We've now finished Shirat Hayam. We say Ki Lashem Hamlucha Umoshel Bagoyim. We're quoting Psalm 22. God's is the kingship. God's is the dominion. God rules over the nations. Right? We said Hashem yimloch le'olam va'ed. Right? That's the culmination of the shir. Hashem yimloch le'olam va'ed. Now we say, indeed, it is God. God does have the dominion. Ve'alu Mosheim b'har Tzion lishpot et har Esav. Va'yital Hashem hamlucha. One day, the redeemers will ascend Mount Zion, casting judgment against Esav. Who's Esav? The grandfather of Amalek. Right? One day, what we're actually saying at the end of this year every day, one day, it's true that Hashem yimloch le'olam va'ed, but actually what we're saying is not yet. Because there's actually something that is limiting, that is challenging God's dominion. And that is Esav, Amalek. One day we say, V'alu Mosheim b'har Tzion lishpot et har Esav, and after that judgment against Esav, then v'haita future, v'haital Hashem hamlucha. Then the kingship will be God's. It's not God's now, fully yet. V'haya Hashem lemelech, quoting Zechariah, v'haya Hashem lemelech al kol haaretz. And then God will become king. V'haya le, become, only then will God become king over the earth. Bayom hahu, in that day, Yashem echad u'shmo echad. So we're saying something very powerful every morning when we say the Shira, right? We're recalling God's redemption of God's people. We're voicing Bnei Yisrael's declaration of God's kingship, and then we're saying, but you got to be aware. We're saying this just before we start the core part of Tefillah. You got to be aware that actually God's dominion isn't yet complete. Right? We're living in a world that God does not fully rule over. We're in a dynamic process that one day we anticipate God's dominion will be complete, but we know that right now it's a war. We're at war. And it's not over. That's what we say every morning. And adding those couple of psukim, those 3 psukim to Az Yashir is making the point, right, is having this reading of Amalek, right? Everybody stepped aside. Next chapter, God should be king and the Chumash should be over. End of human history. God has dominion on this earth. It's all good. No. Somebody fights. Somebody says, not so fast, God. I'm not letting you do it. Yes, sir.
I always interpreted this as a using a messianic error, and it's basically putting the task on people to perfect God's will for partnership with God. Seems to me what you're saying is, or let me just verify, what you're saying is that what this is saying is that Amalek is a power independent of God that can actually challenge God?
I think we're saying the same thing, actually, because I agree with you totally, right? Because the question is, if there is this battle going on, whose battle is it? So I've been emphasizing it's God's battle. Well, how does God fight that battle? Whose job is it to fight this battle against Amalek? Well, the Torah actually has two takes on that, right? In our parsha, in Shemot, what does God say? Right? Ki yad al kesya milchama lashem ba'amalek midor dor. Right? God says in chapter 17, verse 14, Macho emche et zecha Amalek. I will obliterate the remembrance of Amalek. But what do we say in Devarim, in Parshat Zachor, the end of chapter 25? Timche, you've got to obliterate it. So if you just take those two words without anything else, you have it right there. It's God's battle, but actually you are being invited to fight it.
And therefore that Moshe, it's through Moshe's hands. In other words, Moshe has his hands up for the Jews to prevail over Amalek, which is kind of that model of God's battle through human effort.
Right, and I think also, if you think of why we're saying this in Tefillah, I mean, it's something we really need to think about. And I don't think I've thought about it enough myself, but it's very striking. The moment before we start the formal part of Tefillah, which you'd think is the moment at which we want to declare that God's ultimate power is in a way, according to this reading, right? The moment at which we've said, actually, God needs some help here. It's a very different view of Tefillah, that what we're saying is that Tefillah is in essence challenging us in some way to recognize that we have a dynamic role to play in this dynamic battle. Right? The world is a battlefield, and we're in this world to join the fight. Let's work this out, because I think there's a bunch of texts which suggest this. Okay, so let me show a couple. First of all, you have a very nice rabbinic text in Sanhedrin 20b, which says that there's 3 mitzvot that the Jews have when they get to the land. Right after they capture the land, what are the 3 mitzvot that the Jews have to do? The 3 things they have to do. Sorry? Say what? No, I don't mean regular mitzvot. I mean 3 things that they have to do to sort of set themselves up on the land, right? Right. So one is they have to build the Beit HaMikdash, right? Another one, they have to appoint a king, and the third one is destroy Amalek. Okay, so those are the 3 things. And the Gemara says, well, in what order do they have to do it? So in what order do you think you have to do that? We said Mikdash, king, and Amalek. So what order? Can't be that order. That's the point. You can't have the Mikdash before Amalek. That's the point, right? As Yashir says, when all the nations step aside and enable God to be king, then God builds his Mikdash. Amalek shows up in chapter 17 and says, sorry, I'm not laying that, I'm doing battle. So Mikdash cannot come before Amalek. Mikdash means God has dominion on this earth. Full Mikdash hasn't, according to this, full Mikdash has not come yet. Okay, so Mikdash has to be after Amalek, because Mikdash means God has dominion on this earth. Okay, nothing challenges that. It's complete Kisei, right? We're still in case, not in Kisei Hashem. Okay, so Mikdash has to be after. Okay, so now we have king and Amalek. How are we going to order that? King and then Amalek. That's right, because it's the job of the king to fight Amalek, right? It's the job of the king to fight Amalek. We know this because, of course, what is Shaul's downfall? Shaul's downfall is that he fails to destroy Amalek. It's not just that he didn't listen, to every jot and tittle of what Shmuel tells him, which is not insignificant, right? But that's not just what it is. It's that, what does it mean to be a king? What it means to be a king is that you are occupying the terrestrial counterpart of God's celestial throne. Therefore, you have to fight God's battle. So to fail to vanquish Amalek means that you're not king, because that's a king's job. Right? You have this, if you go back to the passage that says, the first page that we read, right? and you see at the top of the page Psalm 89. Right? This is a psalm that's about God's promise of kingship to David. Okay? Right? I've made a covenant with my chosen one, with David, and I'm giving him the kingship. Verse 5, Ad olam, right? Forever, right? I will establish your descendants on the throne. Right? God, I'm establishing David's descendants on the throne. And then it goes on after an ellipsis, verse 10, and it goes back to this mythic language. You, God, you are the one, right, who rules the sea. You are the one who smashed Rahab, right, the goddess of the sea. Right? Verse 15, you are the one who establishes your throne in justice. Well, what does that mean? Right? God, you establish your throne in justice. You do this battle against the forces of evil. Then, reciprocally, if God establishes David's throne, that throne has to be a throne of justice, which means that A, David, meaning the king, has to fight evil, just like God, and B, the flip side of that is David has to establish justice. Now, what's interesting is, what is the moment at which, right, Saul loses his kingship? Right? Saul is told he's going to lose his kingship when he fails to destroy Amalek. But when does Saul actually die? Saul actually dies. We're not going to look at this because we don't have enough time, but if those who are interested, Saul actually dies in chapter 31 of 1 Samuel. What happens in chapter 30? What happens in chapter 30 is that David, the soon-to-be king, right? David fights a battle against Amalek. It's once David fights the battle against Amalek that Saul dies. Meaning it's time for David to take over because David has fought the battle against Amalek. It's a very interesting story because among other things that happen in that story is that there's this whole thing there. Amalek also kind of attacks the weak and the vulnerable, as Amalek is wanted to do. And what happens is that David goes out to battle. He has 600 men. 200 become too weak to fight. 400 continue to fight. And then the 400 want to keep all the spoils for themselves. And David says, what are you talking about? Everybody is going to share equally. And he makes it into a chok umishpat. Right? He establishes this as a rule, a just rule, right? That everybody is going to share equally. And it's at that moment that he both, on the one hand, vanquishes Amalek, right, who I'm portraying as the kind of arch enemy of justice, and establishes just rules. It's at that moment that his kingship, that he essentially becomes king in the sense that David falls, that Saul falls in the very next chapter. Okay? Now, if you look at Sefer Shemot, you have exactly the same trajectory. What happens when Amalek is vanquished, right, in Sefer Shemot? What's the very next thing that happens? Sorry? The very next story is when Yitro comes to visit. And there's two parts of the Yitro story. The first is Yitro's conversation with Moshe, chapter 18, where he rejoices over hearing that God saved God's people. And remember, this is another example of knowledge. He says, now I know, he says, this is chapter 18, verses 10 and 11. Yitro says, blessed is God who saved you from the hand of Mitzrayim. Now I know ki gadol Hashem mikol Elohim, that God is greater than any other God. Why? Because God is not only the most powerful, but God is the God who saves. God is the God of justice. God is the God who helps the downtrodden. And the very next day, he gets up, and what does he see? He sees that the people are seeking justice. And he helps Moshe set up a system that allows the people to build a just society. So I think this juxtaposition is very important, right? You have a juxtaposition between Amalek on the one hand, who I think the Torah is seeing as that force which refuses to acknowledge the God who wants to establish a dominion of justice on this earth. You vanquish Amalek in order to, right, make space for a world in which you build a just society, which means a world in which you bring God's kingship into play. Now, what's interesting, by the way, is that we actually have this juxtaposition as a practice in how scribes write Sifrei Torah, right? Because if you look at the very end of chapter 17, God says to Moshe, Ketov zot zikaron b'sefer. Write this as a remembrance in the book. The book. Now that is very strange. This is the first time that the Torah talks about writing something in a book. And the very next chapter, chapter 18, is where the people are seeking justice. They want to be taught about how to live their lives justly, which of course leads to chapters 19 and 20, which is God giving the Torah. And so you have, the first thing that's written, though, is not the Torah. Right? The first thing that God says to write is not the Torah. The first thing that God says to write is to remember, to obliterate the remembrance of Amalek. Now, we actually do this. A scribe, right? A scribe, anybody know about this? What does a scribe do every time they're about to start writing? They write the word Amalek and they cross it out, right? Torah begins where Amalek ends, right? Mikdash begins where Amalek is destroyed, right? Right? You can only write Torah when you've crossed out Amalek, right? You can only build God's palace when you fought the forces of injustice that try to limit God's dominion. Right? Yep.
Why do you think Moshe doesn't discuss his experience with Amalek and Yitro? You know, it's like what's new, what's happened, and the whole event of Amalek isn't mentioned at all. It seems like it should be there.
Yeah. Michelle's asking why Moshe doesn't discuss Amalek with Yitro. It's a good question. I mean, in a certain way, right, the story of Amalek kind of doesn't belong here. In other words, the fact is the people do go on to build the Mikdash here, right? The story does end with this kind of near perfect world where the people have kind of redone God's original creation and created this sanctuary for God, this palace for God's kavod to manifest. So I think it's not necessarily that sort of plot-wise, right? This exactly happened the day before Yitro came. It may not be that way. It may be the Torah's way of saying that we have to remember that whereas our book, the book of Shemot, is trying to trace this trajectory, right, of God's dominion being first challenged and then complete, of people moving from lack of knowledge of God to knowledge of God, of people moving from the Israelites rejecting Moses' call to justice, right? We talked about this in our Gemara class this week, right? When Moshe says, evil one, why are you hitting your friend? Why are you striking your friend? And they say, what? You're judging us? And then chapter 18, they're all waiting online for his judgment, right? So these are the trajectories that the book is tracing. And the book wants to trace that, but I think at the same, and the book doesn't want to end by saying it's not complete. The book wants to give us a vision of what would it look like for it to be complete. But on the other hand, Shemot is part of a longer book, which is part of a longer book, which is part of our lives, where it's not complete. And so in a way, the Amalek story is not necessarily that happened the day before Yitro came, but it's a marker for saying, that whereas Shemot is able to trace this trajectory, you have to remember that this trajectory is actually never complete. Right? God's dominion is not there. The Mikdash is not built. Right? According to the Midrash, Amalek destroys the temple. Amalek joins with Nebuchadnezzar in the first temple, and in the second temple it is Amalek, right? Because it's Rome, and Rome is Edom, and Edom is Amalek. Right? So the way the rabbis see this is Amalek is always there keeping us from crossing over. Amalek is always there keeping God from achieving full dominion. What I'm trying to sort of highlight is I think that again, in response to what you were saying before, that it's not just that this is it's not just that this is a view about God, that we sort of sit there and watch the battle, it's like what was it on Sunday? Was it the Super Bowl? What was? I'm sorry, I'm so working. What game was it? A Yuri Brit. What game was it we were watching on Sunday? Football, though, yeah. I'm in the right sport. Okay. Okay, very good. See, I'm improving. One day. Okay, so not bad, right? For okay. Okay. You play soccer or whatever.
Yeah.
Croquette. What do you? Okay. Whatever. The point is, it's not just that we're sitting there watching on the big screen this battle, right? It's not just a battle that's happening up there. And interestingly, right, another interpretation that the Mefarshim, that the commentators bring about, Kiyat al-Kes Ya, And we start with Rashi's interpretation. Ramban quotes Rashi's interpretation, then offers another one, right? Ramban's interpretation is, let's take a look at it. It's the second one on this page, the page that starts with Tehillim Pei Tet, second to last passage, okay? And he says the following thing. He says on the fourth line of that passage, V'gam zeh midrash haGemara. This is another midrash that's brought in the Gemara. Sha'amru, and he's quoting Sanhedrin 20, as we mentioned before. Kishahu omer kiyad al kes ya milchama l'Hashem ba'amalek midor dor, when it says God's hand is on, there is a hand on the throne of God to do battle with Amalek. What is that referring to? Harei la'amir alehem melech tchila. What that means is that the first step you have to do when you get into the land, right, is to establish a king. In other words, kes ya, right, a hand on the throne of God doesn't mean God's throne up there. It means the throne that God establishes down here, which is kingship. Right? God appoints a terrestrial mirror of God's dominion. And God appoints a king. And when there is a person on that throne, right? When there is a person on that throne, then that person's job, after there's a king, is to destroy Amalek. So you have, right, in those two interpretations of the verse, the kind of, it's God's battle, right? And it is a battle against God, because God is not complete until God wins that battle. But how is God going to fight that battle? God's going to fight that battle with us participating down here. And us participating down here does not just mean, right, appointing a political leader who fights a national entity called Amalek. Right? The point I'm making in the juxtaposition between, in Sefer Shemot, Amalek, and then seeking justice in the next chapter. Right? In Sefer Shmuel, between Amalek and David establishing justice as he vanquishes Amalek. You have this also, by the way, in Sefer Devarim. Let's look very quickly again at Parshat Zachor. Okay, Devarim chapter 25. What comes right before Parshat Zachor? Remember what Amalek did? What's the passage right before that? Lo yeh lecha b'chischa even v'aven gdola uktana. Right? You can't have different weights in your pockets. You can't have in your house efa ve'efa gdola uktana. You can't have different volume measurements in your house. Rather, 15, even shlema v'tzedek yeh lecha. You should have complete weights, weights of justice. Efa shlema v'tzedek yeh lecha. You should have complete and just measures of volume. God can stand people who act unjustly. This to me is very striking because you have all these other kinds of passages, people who kill each other, people who rape each other, people who not rape each other, I guess, one way. Right? All these terrible crimes, but then it culminates with, you got to be just even in the stones in your pocket. Right? You got to have justice in your house. You have to have justice in your pocket. God can't stand people who don't act justly. And the last law in this whole long corpus of, I don't know how many chapters, or 14 or whatever chapters of laws, don't forget what Amalek did. And again, I think you have that juxtaposition. You have to seek justice. Amalek is the one who does not believe in justice. Amalek is the one who picks on the weak. Amalek is the one who does the opposite of what all Sefer Shemot is about, which is reaching out to those who are weak and marginalized, because that's your experience. Amalek is the one who doesn't get that, who fights that. Right? So when I say join the battle against Amalek, I don't mean only, right, appoint a king who then says, oh, that nation is Amalek, we're going to nuke them. It's about something very different. Right? It's about how we behave in the smallest as well as the largest matters, right? In the weights we carry in our pockets, in the volume measures we have in our house, right? How we behave in the smallest and largest ways to make sure that we're acting in a way that is tzedek, in a way that is just. And when you act in a way that is just, that is destroying Amalek. That's making more room, right? You know, if you think back, an image that I like very much, you think back at this, the creation of the world, right? So God, what does God do? Again, chapter 1, it's very calm, right? God puts some water above, he puts some water below. He says, well, that's pretty good, but I'd like some plants. So God says, you know, maybe the waters below should move aside. They'll stay in one place. We'll have dry land. Then I can make plants, flowers, trees, fruits. Very nice, right? But the Midrashim pick up, and again, sort of in a way picking up on these more dynamic ancient myths, that it wasn't so simple for God to gather those waters to a side and make room for dry land. Because actually the waters want to cover the earth all the time, right? That kind of primordial chaos always wants to take over. It always threatens to take over the world, right? It's not that God simply snaps God's fingers and there's order and that's it. And the image that's offered of this actually is the ocean waves. Right? If you stand at the ocean, right, what you see is that at every moment, that ocean is trying to cover the earth, and it comes and comes and comes, and then it gets pushed back. And that's that dynamic thing right there, right? You're standing there and you say, well, it's not so clear that we have an ordered universe that makes room for people to live, because actually those waters are always trying to come and God is always pushing back. It's a dynamic thing that happens every second of every day. And that really, I think, is the image here, that to the degree to which we're not pushing back those waters, right, those waters are engulfing the world. And so when I talk about a dynamic battle, right, it's God's battle that we have to do, not just by holding up our hands and fighting with our weapons, right, but by writing the Sefer Torah. Writing the Sefer Torah is crossing out Amalek. Crossing out Amalek allows us to write the Torah. Fighting Amalek allows us to to do justice. Doing justice fights Amalek. So let me just sum up, and then I'll release people. If people have questions or comments, they can stay. But I know many of you want to rush to hear the president. What I'm putting out here is, so to get back to where I started tonight, is that there's really two different ways of seeing Amalek, both of which are valid, both of which are there in the Torah, and both of which offer, I think, potent ways to think of our participation in religious life. Right? One is a kind of internal view. Right? What I look inside myself and I say, what is keeping me from crossing over? Right? Ad Yavor, right? What is that thing that is challenging within me? Right? What is that thing? In what ways don't I match up to that picture that God showed the ocean, right, when God created the world? Right? What in me is Lo Yirei Elohim? What in me is saying Hayesh Hashem b'kribenu im ayin? Right? How am I? God's world is a good world. If it's not working out, what in me is not allowing that to work? And that's one important perspective. And then there's another perspective which sometimes works when the first perspective sometimes doesn't work, right? Which is to say, actually, I look at the world, and it's not all that perfect. And it's not always because I or my neighbor didn't look inside themselves and try to match up with the aspiration of who they need to be. Maybe it's because actually the world isn't yet such a good place, which means it's not yet God's world, because it's still in process. Right? God is not Hashem Yimloch, future, right? Vaytal Hashem Hamlucha, one day. Right now, it's a world where God's name and God's throne is not complete, right? And then what is my job, right, in joining that battle to make the world into a place where God's dominion is complete? It's a very different view, right? It's not saying I'm responsible for the evil that's out there. The evil's there. Now, what am I going to do about it? How am I going to bring more good out there to push that water back? It's a very different view. And I think both of them have a place. I think different ones work at different moments. Different ones of them call to us at different times. But they are different views. And the latter view takes evil seriously. Right? Evil is a force out there. And there are times when that is an important thing to be able to say. So I'm going to stop right there. Again, if people have questions or comments, I have about 7 minutes before my taxi comes to take me to the airport. So go ahead. But feel free to go. Yes.
I have a little bit of a struggle with Amalek in a very small way, which is just I don't understand exactly how, like, Amalek is supposed to be the Sauron of the Tanakh, like
The what?
the Lord of the Rings.
Oh, sorry.
Like
Okay.
real people in the world, like exist on the fringes. Why is, on the one hand, it makes sense that Amalek is the grandson of Esau, because then we're in this twin battle, and there's a real poetic into that. But on the other hand, it's like really awful that Esau is the seed of all evil.
Right. I mean, I think, the ace, I mean, I think what you said is exactly right, right? And I think it picks up on both sides, both ways of seeing Amalek, right? One is that you can see it as the kind of the evil twin, right? All right. If I'm up, he's down, right? We're in this, the Yadayim and the coal, right? But the other, really, I think, gets back to the first perspective. The notion that in some way we created Amalek. Okay, maybe he shouldn't keep his anger, but actually we created that anger, right? So that, the focusing on the Esav quality of it can also direct us toward the internal. So at the end of the day, our behavior toward Esav is what sets up this internal enmity. So that can also point us to that first perspective, which is very sobering, right? Yes? Okay.
That was terrific, thank you. Where are you off to?
Israel.
Oh.
Work stuff still.
How was Nepal?
Sorry?
How was Nepal?
It's very interesting. She's
It's fun, it's a tough program,
and it's a tough place.